of its goals, as opposed to kind of the extent to which some of this seems to be backfiring. I read in the news today that Chinese ambassadors in the past week in 6 or 7 different countries were called into the respective foreign ministries and kind of admonished by the foreign ministers for being sort of too, too kind of aggressive and um, overbearing, and so that, which has been dubbed the wolf warrior diplomacy, online, and I think there are real questions about whether that's going to kind of largely serve China's interests, or if it's going to backfire. I mean, I think it's becoming increasingly clear, at least that in certain cases, it's the effect that is coming about is kind of the opposite of the intended effect. And just this morning, I think we saw a good example of how that might kind of unfold in one case that's of particular interest to me, which is in Australia, where in the news now we're seeing that the Chinese ambassador in Canberra made what I would describe as sort of thinly veiled threats to punish Australia economically if Australia kind of proceeds with demands for a formal investigation into the origins of COVID-19. So I know it's being spun a couple of different ways in kind of different reporting streams here, but if you read the original text of the Chinese ambassador's comments, it's pretty clear. I mean, he wasn't quite as direct as some of the coverage perhaps makes it seem, but I think the meaning was very clear. I mean, it was excuse me, actually in certain respects, much like sometimes President Trump says something that is, I think, relatively clear in its meaning, but sort of at least a little bit open to interpretation. And then later on, he sort of walks it back and says, "Oh well, I was just, kind of trying to troll the media or whatever." Right? I mean, I think the Chinese ambassador used sort of that framework for his remarks in a sense, but it was quite clear that what the ambassador was getting at was that Australia is reliant on exports to China, and not just raw materials, but also things like beef and wine, agricultural goods, and reliant also on international students, in particular Chinese students in the higher education sector, and on Chinese tourists in the tourism industry. And I think the language made it pretty clear that that some of those kind of revenue streams would be at risk if Australia took actions that China regarded as contrary to its interests, right? So while the wording may have been, I think, purposefully very slightly vague, for example, the part about tourists, the actual wording was something along the lines of, maybe Chinese tourists wouldn't want to visit a country that infringes on China's interests by, pursuing this kind of diplomatic, tactics, right? So it wasn't as blunt as, we will stop tour groups unless you comply with our demands. But I think the intended meaning was fairly clear, that there would be economic punishment, including suspension or reduction in the number of tourists visiting. And likewise, the other comments, I think, were kind of along those lines as well. Quite similar to the Chinese ambassador in Sweden earlier this year, talking about Chinese investments in the Swedish automobile sector and how many jobs they provided, and suggesting that that could change, if Sweden offended Chinese interests, right? So this kind of diplomatic messaging, I think, is kind of closely related to what we talked about in terms of economic coercion a few weeks ago, but really is also kind of a function of the sort of way that message gets presented in terms of either private or public diplomacy, or maybe both. And so that's worth kind of thinking about how that might backfire here, right? In other words, having more leverage doesn't necessarily make it easier to get what you want. It may depend on how you apply that leverage, how you engage with the other countries that you're trying to influence. And here, I think we're, and to summarize the kind of key findings for this evening, I think we're going to see that the results are kind of mixed, right? That sometimes this will work more or less as China wants it to, in terms of the more kind of assertive diplomatic stance and the information and influence operations, and other times it may be quite the opposite. So, first let's talk a little bit about some, kind of recent trends in Chinese diplomacy, and then we'll jump more into the kind of shaping the information environment and influence operations, and then finally wrap up with a little bit of a discussion of some of the challenges and implications for the U.S. So I think it's fair to say that under Xi Jinping, we're seeing a much more kind of assertive turn in Chinese diplomacy. Like some of the more assertive behavior in other areas, I think some of this can be traced to the latter part of the Hu Jintao era. But I think we are seeing something that really goes beyond that, particularly emerging in the last year or two, of kind of blunter talk, tougher talk, and sometimes pretty, kind of mobster style shakedown language, frankly, from some Chinese diplomats. Now, they're not the only diplomats who go around acting this way, right? But it's new for Chinese diplomats to have this approach, and so I think really worth kind of thinking about. Again, not that it's completely unique in the world, right? But that it's a pretty distinct evolution of China's approach, which traditionally has been most of the time kind of softer spoken. There are some early precursors to this that if we were going to try to say, when did this really start, where we might go back and identify some comments by senior Chinese diplomats that were seen as sort of more blunt, more kind of bullying in tone. I do think that the real shift has come more recently, again in the last year or two. But you could go back further and take a look at, for example, the famous statement by China's foreign minister to the ASEAN countries that China's a big country and they're small countries, and essentially that they'd better get used to those power dynamics, right? So, this kind of tone is not an entirely recent development, but I think it's becoming more kind of more commonplace, and we can talk about why that's the case. I think there are several plausible explanations. I mean, again, it could be that Chinese diplomats have decided this is a good way to demonstrate their kind of nationalist credentials, a good way to get noticed by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs leadership in Beijing, a good way to get promoted, right? So there may be kind of individual incentives that are driving people to move more in this direction. They may, to a certain extent, be kind of more responsive to guidance from the foreign ministry to kind of take a tougher tone and a more assertive stance in defense of Chinese interests. That, in turn, could be because the foreign ministry itself, I think, tends to, from interactions with some Chinese counterparts, I think it's fair to say that it tends to be a little bit nervous about being portrayed as kind of weak and ineffective in bureaucratic circles in Beijing, right? So there could be kind of an institutional incentive to have kind of this tougher stance, that it's about the foreign ministry showing that it's out there kind of at the as in the vanguard defending Chinese interests. So we may be looking at some individual and institutional incentives that are shaping some of this behavior, but it's also becoming sort of so widespread that I think it's hard to avoid the conclusion that it's also sort of top down, centrally directed, that that this is not just about certain Chinese diplomats trying to make a name for themselves, not just about the Ministry of Foreign Affairs kind of trying to insulate itself from charges that it's weak-kneed in dealing with foreign countries, but that this also does reflect sort of a preferred approach for Xi Jinping's sort of strategy for dealing with foreign and security policy, that it's supposed to be a more kind of forward-leaning, more aggressive approach in certain respects. So I think there may be several factors at play, but I think we really do have to look at it as kind of a stage in Chinese diplomacy that probably reflects leadership guidance to be tougher and appear more assertive. One of the kind of interesting dynamics that's unfolded over the last roughly year and a half or so is the extent to which Chinese diplomacy is really jumping onto social media platforms and Twitter in particular and of course that's not available inside China, for the most part, but for their external jousting with foreign counterparts and foreign scholars and so on. It's a platform that they're increasingly relying on. And when I say Chinese diplomats are using it more and more, I have in the PowerPoint slides tonight that a quote from one study that found that in October 2018, there were only 17 Chinese diplomats who had Twitter accounts. And by February of this year, it was up to 80. So, more than a fourfold increase in a little over a year. And again, I think that pretty clearly reflects what we can imagine as some central direction to engage more directly via Twitter, because we've gone from, again, a quite modest number of Chinese diplomats who had Twitter accounts, and apart from the handful of them really didn't do a whole lot with their accounts, to a much larger number. Again, many of whom are taking kind of a more combative approach to their kind of social media interactions. And again, I think that they kind of find this useful for several reasons. The kind of most straightforward one is it's a increasingly common way to kind of engage with an international audience. So, I mean, in a certain way, China would be sort of conspicuous by its absence if it wasn't doing more of this, right? So there is kind of more of a general trend that China is taking part in here as well. But it's what you choose to do with it, of course, is more of a reflection of their approach to diplomacy and how it's changing under Xi Jinping. And so there's more kind of debating foreign scholars and media personalities, more that going kind of beyond the sort of broader direction that Chinese media and diplomacy should tell China's story and kind of do a good job telling it, right? They're clearly in a sort of a more combative mode. A lot of the Chinese diplomats who are on Twitter, and so I think that again we're kind of seeing something that embodies kind of a range of different activities and has sort of different reasons behind it. Okay, and again, and it ranges from sort of what I would characterize as assertive but professional promotion of Chinese interests, kind of at one end of the spectrum here, up to kind of retweeting discredited conspiracy theories at the other, right? And so there's a fair amount in between. But as a Maryland resident who lives not too far from Fort Detrick, I can't help but be slightly taken aback when I see Chinese officials retweeting conspiracy theories that COVID-19, emerged from Fort Detrick lab out here in Frederick, Maryland, right? So they're kind of retweeting both, what by U.S. standards would be like far right and far left conspiracy theories, and I don't, that aspect of this, I kind of don't get what they think they're going to accomplish, except maybe to kind of muddy the waters about responsibility for the origins of the outbreak. And I mean, I am surprised that they're using kind of official Twitter accounts or diplomats' Twitter accounts for that purpose, when it would seem to be something that might kind of discredit those individuals. And if you want to do it as kind of a disinformation operation of one sort or another, presumably there would be ways to kind of keep that at arm's length while still trying to, sort of confuse the messaging that's out there about, how this all started. So again, the kind of range of activities, again, sort of spans from ones that I think are likely to kind of serve the desired purposes, even if they kind of ruffle some feathers, all the way up to ones that are almost certain to be counterproductive and to kind of diminish the credibility of the officials who are involved in the activity. So, what does this all amount to, though? Well, apart from the sort of disinformation part, I think it mostly is about trying to demonstrate willingness to get tough in defense of Chinese interests. I think that's really sort of the principal motivation that underlies the kind of Twitter engagement strategy that the Chinese diplomats are using now. And I've also included in the slides for tonight handles for some noteworthy accounts that some of you probably already are taking a look at, but may be new to others. And I'll just mention a couple that I think are really worth taking a look at, because they're kind of they sort of, I think, serve sort of different purposes. So. Li Jianjiao, who's the spokesperson and Deputy Director General of the Information Department of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, was probably the first Chinese diplomat to be really prominent on Twitter for, frankly, being like cranky and offensive. Right? That's sort of his style, and I think we can judge by. And so when he was a deputy. He was a deputy consul general in Pakistan, I think, when he first started his kind of to develop his Twitter persona. And the fact that he was promoted from there, I think, suggests pretty strongly that that's behavior that was encouraged or at least welcomed, as opposed to something that foreign ministry, senior leaders in Beijing found problematic. Right? If they had a problem with that, presumably they wouldn't have elevated him into a role where he has kind of the outward-facing responsibilities for kind of information and propaganda for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson office also has an official Twitter handle that is not specific to any individual member of their office, but belongs to the whole office, which is at MFA_China. That's the one that they use for, by and large, for what I would consider kind of more standard diplomatic messaging. The Chinese ambassador to the U.S., Cui Tiankai, who's also a SAIS graduate, is a prominent Chinese official diplomatic presence on Twitter, and is, by and large, kind of stays out of sort of the more or the most controversial areas. Or I would be quite surprised to see Ambassador Cui, tweeting conspiracy theories. Right? I mean, he can be quite assertive in defense of Chinese interests, but he appears to think that in terms of his responsibilities for managing the relationship with the U.S., a somewhat more, kind of normal diplomatic approach is appropriate to accomplish his goals. So, his account is very, very different in terms of the style and tone in particular, as compared to somebody like Li Jianjiao, who's much more prone to be, very pointed, as well as to kind of have some of the conspiracy theory content. So, just for, kind of examples of the kinds of things that that you might see, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson's account basically uses that handle to kind of put out the same information that they release in their press briefings, or that they put out on their website. So it's just another vehicle or another platform to to reach a broader audience, but with the same kind of content that they would normally present elsewhere. So in the slides for tonight, I just have an example of China using that handle to kind of underscore the message that they are not going to be part of trilateral arms control talks with the U.S. and Russia, right? So that was a message that they have kind of foot stomped in a number of different settings, including the spokesperson's press availabilities and so on. And then they also put it on Twitter, I think, to to kind of ensure that it reaches the full desired audience. And I thought it was kind of interesting what they chose to highlight. So what you see here on, when they tweet about content that they're sort of taking from elsewhere and kind of cutting and pasting, what they choose to highlight, though, is still, I think, quite interesting. And in this particular example, the spokesperson's account not only highlighted China's unwillingness to engage in those trilateral arms control discussions that the U.S. is pushing for, but concluded the brief excerpt from a longer statement that they tweeted by saying, "We have full understanding from the international community, including Russia." And those last two words really are the kind of critical ones. I think it was their way of kind of highlighting the message that while the U.S. may be interested in increasing the pressure on China to join these talks, as we discussed last week, that's not going to work unless that pressure from the U.S. is accompanied by matching pressure from Russia, realistically. And they're, I think Russia, as much as they may be concerned about aspects of Chinese nuclear force modernization, probably also sees it as a useful counterweight to the US. And therefore, China is able to kind of send the message here that they're resisting the pressure, and they have Russia's got their back, essentially, was the kind of the message here. Some of the kind of testier exchanges that they get into, I've included a couple of examples of those from the briefing as well. So I have Hua Chunying, who's another one of the spokespersons in the information department, responding to some of Secretary Pompeo's statements about COVID-19 and saying that it's even more hazardous and dangerous than the virus itself is using political motives to blame people for the outbreak, right? That's sort of the theme of some of those kind of more pointed exchanges that are at this point have kind of really just devolved into kind of a what I think to most observers probably looks like just sort of a back and forth of blaming each other for blaming each other, essentially. And so we can also see some of those more sharply worded exchanges over things like China's expulsion of U.S. reporters, which of course followed the U.S. putting a kind of personnel cap on Chinese official media in the U.S. Of course, I mean, there's obviously a big asymmetry there because the Chinese media organizations are state-run or party-run official media representatives, whereas the U.S. counterparts in China are reporters who work for the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New York Times. So there's a big asymmetry there, just in terms of the the kinds of organizations that people work for, right? But I think the kind of goal here with all of the tweeting and retweeting that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs did was to try to sort of suggest that notwithstanding that asymmetry, China's response was kind of a tit for tat for the U.S. Restrictions on Chinese official media. Again, I've got a few more examples of some of Li Jianzhao's tweets in the PowerPoint briefing. Again, some of them are more or less kind of standard fare. They're kind of assertive but diplomatic. Others are just sort of curious things like retweets of cute cat and dog videos and stuff. I mean, he does that too. And then others are basically kind of promoting conspiracy theories, right? Which certainly, unfortunately, we've got politicians in the U.S. who do that also. And in fairness, right? But it's, I think, for somebody who is doing that as the spokesperson of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, it implies some level of official endorsement for that, even if he's doing it with his personal account, as opposed to the spokesperson's account. So nevertheless, I think this is, it's an area that is very much worth watching. And also, when you kind of get beyond the sort of fully official accounts, there are some others that I think are quite interesting. Hu Shizhen from the Global Times in particular is another one that's worth watching. I'll say honestly, I don't always know how to interpret some of what he puts out on Twitter, because Global Times is state media. However, it's quite a bit more freewheeling than something like People's Daily, to be sure. And some of what he tweets looks to me like sort of a kind of a policy trial balloon, or a kind of hint or kind of unofficial version of a message that perhaps leaders in Beijing have decided that they want to send out. But other things that he tweets, I think, appear to me to be more a reflection of his own views. And it can be, at least, I consider it to be sort of challenging sometimes to distinguish between the different functions that one of his tweets might be performing. So I find this to be, probably well, it might be a good subject for, for some enterprising graduate students, term paper or thesis research, and probably would be worth kind of putting in a comparative context to see sort of how China might be handling this relative to some other countries. But but when you take a look at some of what he tweets, I think some of it is sort of messaging that appears to have some kind of official background to it, but that they want to have in a sort of attributable but not authoritative kind of platform to put it out. Um, in other cases, it's a little bit harder to kind of interpret. So I think there's a lot going on here that's interesting. So that's kind of what I wanted to say about Chinese diplomacy. Next, I want to get into more of the kind of information and influence operations. Recognizing that there's no entirely kind of clean line that distinguishes or separates the two. Because clearly, particularly as some Chinese diplomats kind of get more involved in the kind of sort of information manipulation and sort of kind of social media disinformation game, it gets harder to kind of cleanly distinguish diplomacy and information operations. But I mean, it's of course still a worthwhile distinction, and I'm trying to make it as cleanly as possible, even though in certain respects it might be a little bit easier to do as kind of a theoretical fact or theoretical sort of factor, and a little harder to do maybe in real life. But I think it still makes sense to kind of talk about information operations and influence operations as related to, but in some respects kind of distinct from Chinese diplomacy. So before I get into the kind of second half here, looking at influence operations, any questions about Chinese diplomacy, the kind of more sort of traditional diplomatic functions that anybody wants to ask before we jump into information operations, kind of united front activities and influence operations?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
A very general question. This may be a prompt too long of an answer, but is there something in particular that's unique about Chinese diplomacy since the Chinese Civil War, since the PRC has taken over? Is there something that is that characterizes Chinese diplomacy? Or they generally follow the same protocols and practices as most sort of major powers?
And I think they, largely, well, increasingly resemble other major powers. I mean, to kind of take a step back, or several step backs, if we were to kind of characterize Chinese diplomacy in the Mao era, he clearly wanted it to have more of a revolutionary kind of flavor, right?
Mhm.
Yet it still performed, all of the kind of normal diplomatic functions that, big countries diplomats perform. Um, Maybe one of the characteristics of it that really did kind of evolve over time is that it became sort of increasingly professionalized. So there are a couple of good books, including one entitled Chinese Ambassadors that hopefully some of you are familiar with already, that kind of traces the sort of professionalization of the diplomatic corps over time. So whereas in the Mao era, kind of revolutionary sort of fervor and politically speaking, sort of political reliability and things were principal qualifications. Um, by the time we got into the Deng era, and certainly in relatively more recent years, um, foreign area knowledge, advanced degrees, foreign language skills, professional training, are much more the kind of characteristics that we would associate with Chinese diplomats. So, you're even just in the 20 years that or so that I've been working in these areas, you are today, when you deal with Chinese diplomats, very likely to encounter people who have excellent foreign language skills, who have one or more advanced degrees, who have studied someplace outside of China for one of those, either as most commonly for a master's degree, or for a kind of mid-career certificate program. And they are, generally speaking, highly skilled, polished, effective. They're good at what they do. Now, maybe we're seeing a little bit of a turn now at in the direction of being more, of a bomb thrower like Li Jianzhao. But in terms of the kind of, qualifications and characteristics, I mean, I think Chinese diplomats now are, every, quite similar to, other major powers, well-trained, highly educated, talented, hardworking diplomats. Now, again, I mean, maybe there's kind of an element of something that may be short-lived here with all the conspiracy theory retweeting and stuff, because that obviously doesn't reflect well on whether it's Li Jianzhao or anyone else's diplomats who are doing that. I don't think that's helpful or professional or constructive, right? But but the kind of general profile of the Chinese diplomat over time, I guess, has really shifted from sort of politically reliable, and imbued with revolutionary fervor, to a lot like everyone else's diplomats in terms of the degrees from SAIS or LSE or whatever top global universities. Excellent language skills, solid area knowledge for the countries that they deal with, and so on. And when answers are too long, that's my fault, not yours.
No. It was a big question. It was a big question is the reason I asked, not because I thought you would be long.
Sure, no problem. All right, let's see. I see a couple other hands up on the kind of diplomacy questions. Ben, I think you were next in the queue.
Yeah, so my question is more technical. Then, have you ever been able to communicate with Chinese diplomats and ask how they reconcile Chinese existing regulations, as in, like, they can't access Twitter in China. They need to use a VPN, which, to my knowledge, is illegal, but they still can access Twitter and expand or express their opinion unlike other Chinese citizens. So have you been able to ask them how they reconcile that, or is that never an issue?
So I don't know about the technical modalities. I mean, I just assume that. So first of all, if they're like an ambassador posted overseas, they have access to whatever is available in that location. If they're at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs headquarters in Beijing, I assume that they have more or less kind of unconstrained internet access, at least in terms of things that are professionally relevant, right? So even if Western media is blocked kind of on the internet, or certain Western media outlets are blocked generally, and Twitter is inaccessible and so on. If you're in a professional position that requires you to engage on those platforms or to gather information from them, I just assume that it's available to them directly, and wherever they're working. I don't know exactly how that works, but that's my assumption. And yes, I mean, I know I haven't done it myself, but I mean, I've certainly witnessed a number of exchanges in which Western counterparts will say to Chinese diplomats, how do you kind of reconcile Twitter being unavailable to Chinese citizens, but being this kind of vehicle that you're increasingly active on to get China's message out to the outside world. And I don't know that there is a good answer to that. I mean, the one that's typically offered is, it's meant for external diplomacy and kind of external propaganda, and so that's different than what may be permissible or impermissible based on our domestic censorship regulations, right? So they kind of try to say basically, it's a suitable thing for us to use for our professional work, and that's unrelated to it being censored at home. Now, I mean, I see a clear, kind of contradiction there, but I think they, generally speaking, try to sort of explain it as different purposes, and they'll often say, well, there are lots of Chinese language microblogs like Twitter that everybody uses within China, which is true, but not really, doesn't really answer the question in my book. Let's see. I've got at least one other hand raised here. Okay, let's see. How about Chi Zhang? Is that? Do you have your hand up, or?
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
My question is about that. recently the Twitter shut down several accounts of Chinese diplomats. I think remember include the Chinese ambassadors to Sri Lanka and Cyprus, and some of the U.S. lawmakers also said that Twitter should ban the voice of some Chinese diplomats. So I want to ask, do you think that America likes the Chinese diplomats using Twitter, and will they restrict the free speech of the Chinese diplomats?
So, Twitter can do basically whatever it wants, right? I mean, they don't have to, within, within the confines of what's legal, right? I mean, they don't have to listen to, Senator Cotton, or I think that's who it was, or whoever it was who suggested that they should, ban Chinese diplomats. I think the argument that was basically made was you shouldn't let Chinese diplomats on your platform when your platform is banned within China. I mean, that's a good talking point, but it's also not, how their terms of service works. I don't think, right? Look, I mean, I would say Twitter should ban any user who violates its terms of service. Being a diplomat who's kind of aggressive or bullying or rude, generally speaking, won't violate their terms of service, and so I don't think they should ban people who are doing that. Some of the kind of sharing of conspiracy theories and things might be in another category, right? So there may be certain individual tweets that I could see getting removed. There could be users who would be, I imagine, who would have their account frozen or suspended just in accordance with Twitter's normal policy because of their behavior on the platform. And that's fine. It's their they're a private company. It's their platform. But as a general rule of thumb, I would not say that we should block Chinese diplomats from using Twitter solely because Twitter is censored domestically within China, right? I don't think that really makes sense, and I think also there's, as aggravating as some in the U.S. are probably finding it, it's also a useful additional kind of communications channel, I think, for us to try to have a better understanding of the messages that that China's trying to send. I mean, I kind of in principle sympathize with, obviously, with the argument that platforms like Twitter should be available to Chinese citizens to use, but they're not, and I don't think that that's in and of itself an appropriate reason to kick Chinese diplomats off of Twitter. Now, again, if they do something else that violates the terms of service specifically, then they should get treated the same as anyone else, I would say. But that's sort of a different question, right? So, for example, tweeting. I mean, maybe some of the conspiracy theories that might result in harm to individuals or groups of people or something would probably should get anyone banned for violating the terms of service, whether they're a diplomat or a private citizen or whatever. But kind of ordinary kind of use of the platform, I don't think should be denied to officials from countries that restrict it domestically. That just doesn't, I mean, to me, that doesn't make sense. I mean, yes, it's there's kind of a double standard there, obviously, but I still think it's worth having the opportunity to hear from and debate and engage, even if Twitter is blocked within China. So that's, I mean, that's that's kind of my take on it. Ashley, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I just want to share some of my knowledge about VPN in China. I think,
oh, sure, go ahead.
in general, you have authorized VPN for certain groups of people, like ambassadors or certain universities or certain firms or like state enterprises in China. They have authorized VPNs which allow them to get access for foreign websites. And in terms of the fact of contradiction, of apparently use Twitter as a diplomatic tool while you are in general banned from foreign access of websites, it's actually like not just a problem on a governmental level. As far as I know, there have been like several cases, public events actually, like when there have been a debate over, for example, Taiwan issue, and Chinese netizens organized a event to get over, detour the Great Firewall, and get in to the Twitter and to respond to other remarks of anti, like those kind of remarks on Twitter or like Facebook. And the fact is, like, they don't actually realize that they are banned from Twitter by firewall, but they are kind of enjoying the whole like triumph of getting out of the firewall to fight against like anti I don't know how to like against certain against nationalist sentiments, basically. So that's kind of a contradiction. Not only appears on a governmental level, but also on a grassroots level as well, that you see. And as a additional comment, I think that kind of reveals a basic problem for China's diplomatic attempts, basically, because China's diplomacy is largely state controlled. Well, it is state controlled, basically, and you don't, like, even with Twitters, you're probably thinking that those ambassadors have certain orders or at least allowance from the central government to say certain things, like what we see with previous ambassadors about the conspiracy of American military coronavirus attempt. So you wouldn't assume that they just voluntarily or individually make those comments. So what China is facing now is, because it's state-controlled media and its general absence on Twitter in general, they don't really have public diplomacy tools. Like when China attempts to do public diplomacy, for example, on Twitter, like what other countries might do, people would instinctively think this is a governmental move, not as a public diplomatic move. So that kind of like really limited China's maneuvering space in the public. So everything Chinese officials do would not be individualized. It would be a governmental kind of attempt. So I think that's very interesting in terms of China's foreign policy and diplomatic attempts in general.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for sharing your thoughts on that. I think I don't see any other hands up, so let me get a little bit into some of the influence operations before, so we can get through that before we go on break. And here, I think the kind of interesting aspect of this is, if Chinese diplomacy is, of course, sort of not really that unique. I mean, in the Xi era, it's getting more pointed, more assertive, and all of that. But it's ultimately not particularly unique to China how Chinese diplomats try to advance Chinese interests. On the influence operation side, I think we do see some things that are more, if not totally unique, have certainly been kind of developed and adapted in China in ways that are kind of different, maybe, than what we're accustomed to, based on our own experience. And that's the kind of overall approach to political influence operations, right? So this is there are a variety of different kind of elements of this. We talked a little bit about some of the social media influence operations ahead of the elections in Taiwan. We've talked already tonight a little bit about some of the, using social media to spread disinformation and misinformation and so on. But there's also another element to this that's more large scale and composed of large numbers of people and activities, kind of under the sort of broader heading of United Front work, that we tend to, I think, is often described as United Front work by Chinese sources, that we kind of talk about it as kind of influence operations. And the basic idea here is to kind of one of the kind of famous quotes from Chinese sources is to sort of disintegrate the opposition and kind of build up the friendly parties. So the basic idea underlying this is that China can use its sort of covert or overt or sort of semi-overt influence operations to try to influence the policies that other countries pursue toward China. And so this is, again, it's not something that is unique to China, but the way they do it, the way they're organized to do it, is kind of more kind of China specific. And if we want to look at some recent case studies, I think the two that are probably receiving the most attention recently, apart from Taiwan, which is maybe kind of a unique case in certain respects, but the two other cases that I think are getting a lot of attention are Australia and New Zealand. And I would suggest that they're getting a lot of attention because there's been more kind of uncovering of that type of activity there, not necessarily because they're unusual as targets, right? I think that China engages in this type of united front work and influence operations really all around the world, in any place that's important enough to Chinese interests to merit the investment. And so I think what is kind of noteworthy about Australia and New Zealand largely is that um, a lot of what China was doing was kind of uncovered and publicized in those locations. So they're ones I think we can kind of take a look at to try to understand how some of this works, and also to understand what kind of responses are likely in other countries that are now kind of investigating, where either governments are investigating or journalists are trying to kind of unravel the kind of networks that China is using to expand its influence in other countries as well. And so what we've seen as more and more of these stories have become public in Australia and New Zealand is that Chinese political influence activities are just coming under a lot more both official scrutiny and kind of media scrutiny than they have until recent years, right? So they're not necessarily, they're certainly not, they're not a new development, but the level of attention that's being devoted to them, and the kind of the waves that they're making in sort of public and political debate is kind of new. And so here we're looking at not only things like the activities of Chinese language media that has Chinese government investment, state-owned enterprises, kind of think tanks or other organizations that China has set up to manage relationships with or influence people in different countries. Organizations like the Confucius Institutes. And so on, right? So there are a whole bunch of different activities that are kind of wrapped up in this broader collection of sort of Chinese approaches to influence. And we've seen, for example, in Australia, some cases like Australian politicians who became very close to kind of Chinese interests, and subsequently, this has just generated a lot more, sort of scrutiny about, what some activity that's kind of lobbying. In basically like lobbying activity, and some of which looks sort of more, kind of clandestine and sort of potentially nefarious. Maybe another way to think of this for those who haven't yet had a chance to kind of dive into it and learn more about this is, also kind of take a look at the way that Russia has done some of this over the years, right? We see, funding for favored political groups overseas that they think will advance their interess. Kind of use of different lobbyists and different cutouts to kind of promote the agenda that they prefer, and so on. And so some of what China is doing, kind of mirrors that, but they're sort of organized differently to perform those activities. Some of it's kind of different, and there may be more of a convergence as everyone studies what everyone else is doing. But one thing that is happening also is that as more of this activity gets uncovered, we're seeing more pushback, not just more scrutiny, but more kind of specific policy measures that are put in place to curtail the kind of effects of this type of activity that are seen as more problematic or nefarious in one way or another. So we've seen now in Australia and New Zealand, new laws that are aimed at curbing or curtailing foreign influence activities. Kind of stricter rules about disclosure of who's performing kind of lobbying or political work on behalf of foreign interests, and also stricter regulation of campaign contributions to prevent foreign donations from influencing political campaigns. So some pretty big changes. I think it's fair to say that Australia kind of responded more rapidly, and that New Zealand has been well, not necessarily lagging behind. I mean, more kind of catching up after getting off to a somewhat later start than Australia did in trying to kind of adjust its legal frameworks and the like to sort of keep up with and respond to this type of activity. If we kind of think about the outlook for the U.S. and what this means for the U.S. As well as its allies and partners who may kind of share concerns about this, I mean, I think it's fair to say that kind of combining the more assertive diplomacy and the in certain countries at least more kind of aggressive influence operations. Well, what we're really seeing is that under Xi Jinping, China's kind of quest for global influence and for power and influence is really kind of entering, I think, a new phase that some outside observers were predicting for a while, but I think maybe comes as a little bit more of a surprise to others. When we see these kind of shifts in Chinese diplomacy and more kind of a information or kind of ideological domain kind of struggle that's taking place with the state media, propaganda, influence operations, social media, disinformation, all of this stuff taken together. Plainly there are some major new challenges, I think, for the U.S. and its allies and partners to deal with. How to appropriately kind of regulate and restrict these kinds of activities is not a straightforward question for democratic societies to deal with. I mean, there are some things that are pretty straightforward, right? If you want to, most countries ban foreign campaign contributions, right? That's and for those who haven't done it yet, many of them I think will start doing it now. New Zealand is a partial exception there, but I think they're trying to ban the kinds of foreign campaign contributions that we would ordinarily, consider most problematic. But right, so in most countries, something like that is pretty clear cut. If you go on a U.S. political candidate's website to donate money, you'll see language that indicates who's permitted and who's not permitted to donate money, right? So everyone has rules and regulations about this. In places where they were kind of lax before, they're likely to kind of tighten them up. But then there are other areas where I think it's how to best respond is a lot less straightforward. One good example of that is the kind of sort of escalating tit for tat between the U.S. and China over Chinese state-run media personnel in the U.S. and U.S. reporters in China. So you could argue on the one hand that the Trump administration was fully justified in wanting to restrict the activities of Chinese official media employees in the United States, because if it's state-run / party-run official media, they are kind of qualitatively different than employees of a private news organization, right? And I think there's that plus the for many years, China has used official media as cover for intelligence operations, also, which are not, obviously not every Chinese official media journalist, but they've done that in some instances. So there are a set of concerns that arise there that that one could certainly argue that curtailing or restricting or regulating in some way the activities of official media personnel makes sense as a policy approach, right? On the other hand, if it is providing an excuse for China to kick out U.S. reporters, we may end up losing more than we gain through that kind of tit for tat exchange, right? I mean, I think that it's probably fair to say that not just U.S. scholars, but also U.S. officials really benefit a lot, and I think the U.S. public more broadly, right, really benefits a lot from having talented, enterprising, fearless U.S. journalists in China to report on what's going on and make us all better informed, right? So if we're losing that or having that that resource gets kind of severely diminished because of Chinese retaliation for the U.S. Actions to put more controls on their state media employees, I'm not sure that there's a counter argument here that we've ended up leaving ourselves worse off, right? How to deal with certain aspects of this, like campaign finance stuff, I think pretty straightforward. We don't want in the U.S. and Australia doesn't want, a lot of other countries don't want foreign campaign contributions to come in through straw donors and the like, so we can try to investigate that and prevent that and so on, right? How to deal with some of the other aspects of this competition or confrontational aspects of this competition in the information domain, less straightforward, right? What do we do about handling Chinese official media? That may result in retaliation that ends up leaving us worse off, right? So we've got some areas where I think the policy prescriptions are not so hard to figure out, and others where there are, I think, reasonable arguments for or against different courses of action. Now, there may also, apart from all of the challenges that this imposes on the U.S. and other countries, I think pretty clearly, I think there are some opportunities here, and particularly where Chinese diplomats may kind of overstep by being more pushier than host countries really want to tolerate. That might create some diplomatic openings for the U.S. Likewise, where some of the influence operations get uncovered and raise concerns about how China is trying to win friends and influence people in its favor in those particular countries. That may provide some incentives to work more closely, not only with the U.S., but with other countries that have experienced similar challenges, to work either kind of bilaterally or multilaterally as more of a kind of network of countries with shared concerns. And there may be a more, I don't think there's going to be kind of a totally united pushback against China here, but I think that there may be, more of a cooperative response maybe than China had anticipated. Incidentally, it's also going to kind of, I think, spark a desire to work more closely with Taiwan in these areas for a lot of countries, because many of them have reached the conclusion that Taiwan is the first place that China will try out all of its new influence or social media disinformation or other kinds of activities, both because it's, I think, probably the case that the Chinese officials who are responsible for these activities view Taiwan as a relatively easy target, but also because it's such a high priority target, right? So it's going to, inherently be the kind of testing ground for a lot of Chinese approaches to political influence and information operations, and that in turn will motivate other countries to up their level of exchanges with Taiwan to learn more about what they are absorbing from the mainland, and how how to kind of craft best practices in terms of responses, right? So if you're looking at ways in which this might be counterproductive for China, well, this is one of them. Not just that you'll get more stringent regulations, more pushback, say in Australia or New Zealand or maybe in the US, right? But also that other countries will feel like they have more of an incentive to engage in exchanges with Taiwan, which of course is, if China wants to kind of cut Taiwan off diplomatically, well, this is going to sort of backfire in the sense that, Sweden or, Denmark or other European countries that are worried about these kinds of Chinese activities may want to engage more with Taiwan to learn more about Taiwan's experiences in these areas, right? So you'll see, I think, more countries reaching out to Taiwan, and that will be from China's point of view, probably another way in which some of these activities, sort of end up imposing some sort of unintended side effects that impose some costs on Chinese diplomacy, and this is likely to be another one of them, I think. So why don't we take about a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back, and I'm happy to field any other questions. We can try to engage in a little bit of a discussion. So let's take 5 and come back. I've got 7:10 on my clock here, so we'll come back at 7:15. Thanks. Okay, welcome back. Hopefully you're all still with me here, and we've got some time for discussion, for any questions before we wrap up. Oh, before we do that though, I just wanted to quickly mention for papers and presentations over the next couple weeks, you'll get back from me some at least brief comments on your presentations and papers and grades, and then I will I'll kind of post the final grades to the registrar when I've received most everyone's stuff. So it will not happen immediately, both because there will be some papers and presentations that are subject to extensions, and also just because there are, something like 70, 70 or 72 papers and presentations for me to go through. So it's going to take a little while, but I promise to try to turn them around as quickly as I can, given the current circumstances and the large number of papers to read and presentations to view. So may take a bit, but you'll hear from me. And certainly, if anyone has any concerns about the last paper or the presentation, please don't hesitate to email to let me know. So now why don't we get into the discussion here. Any questions or comments on anything that we've talked about so far? Jonah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you something that's maybe a bit too newsworthy for this class, but I wanted to put some of the comments by Senator Cotton, actually mentioned him earlier in class, about Chinese students in American universities. Is it smart from the U.S. perspective to be engaging in some of the more heated and zero-sum rhetoric that maybe seeing on the Chinese side as well? And then how to handle, in the context of Chinese influence operations, how do we handle Chinese students coming over to the United States?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, so I think you're referring to Senator Cotton's comments. I think he was on Fox News within the past couple days, and this is I guess, sort of a long-running issue for him. But a brief summary of his comments for anyone who missed it. Essentially, he said, well, if we're going to have Chinese students in the U.S. at universities and graduate programs, they should be studying U.S. politics and Shakespeare. He said, I'm not sure if he knows that Shakespeare is British, but in any case, he thought they should be studying U.S. politics and English literature for some reason. Excuse me, not supercomputing, I think was his line. So, okay, I mean, he's expressing a legitimate concern about international students and Chinese students in particular, and international students from certain other countries as well, studying in sensitive technical fields that have obvious national defense implications, right? That's a legitimate policy problem that I think people can discuss and debate. And on the one hand, you've got the concern about advancing the high-tech weapons programs of strategic competitors, right, as an unintended outcome of opening those fields to study for Chinese students, Russian students, etc. Okay, on the other hand, a lot of the talent that's available is global, and for the U.S. to be successful in advancing knowledge and conducting research that has both commercial and scientific and defense, maybe all three applications in those areas, well, we're probably doing ourselves a disservice if we wholesale cut off students coming in to study in those areas, right? So there's a policy issue there that probably can be resolved in a sort of nuanced, productive way, hopefully. It might be hard in the current political climate, but it seems like it should be possible, at least theoretically. But the kind of broader question of of Chinese students in the U.S., I mean, I think it's great that there are Chinese students in the U.S. because they learn more about the United States, and maybe, and for those who return to China, carry some of that knowledge back. And we learn more about how they see the world, and what they think is going on between the U.S. and China by having them here, right? So I mean, I think that there's a good reason to do that. I think we certainly should not sort of imply that all international students generally, or Chinese students specifically, who are here are trying to steal technology or something like that, right? I mean, that's pretty obviously kind of racist, right? And there's, I think what we're starting to see reflected in some of the Twitter back and forth over not just Senator Cotton's comments, but a few other instances recently, is that a lot of things that should kind of be dealt with as public policy issues are really going to get wrapped up in kind of very sort of nasty U.S. politics, unfortunately. And I don't think that we're going to do ourselves any great service by treating it that way. I'll just give one good example. I'm forgetting which reporter it was now. I think it was maybe Ed Wong from the New York Times. I mean, I could be forgetting who it was, but had kind of a tweet thread within the last day or two, in which he basically said that he was, essentially reporting on I guess a leaked document from, I think, the Republican senatorial campaign committee or something like that. That that essentially said, well, we're going to have a hard time politically defending Trump's handling of the virus and pandemic preparations in the U.S. So instead, let's kind of dodge that question, go on the offensive, and go after China. And okay, I mean, that's their political strategy, but if you're going to, right, if it ends up being implemented in a way that results in abuse of a group of people within the U.S., that's no good. Okay, and so what the reporter who was tweeting about this was saying essentially amounted to that, and they immediately got attacked by a couple of other Twitter users saying, well, are you a reporter, or are you a Chinese Communist Party agent, or are you both, right? And so and the reporter, of course, responded, well, your response to my tweet only proves my own point, which was correct. So I think that's unfortunately kind of where we are on some of that right now, and we need to do better. People who have kind of positions of responsibility need to do better. So it's difficult, though, because there are legitimate policy questions about, for example, whether certain particularly sensitive research programs should be U.S. only, or U.S. and allies and partners nationals only, or what have you, right? I think you can have a real discussion about that. But some of the more the argument that is kind of like really just sort of amounts to let's try to focus blame on somebody else to score political points is not not a good thing for the U.S. It's obviously bad on a number of levels. One of which is that it kind of, I think, plays into the hands of the messaging that the Chinese Communist Party wants to use anyway, which is basically that the U.S. is trying to blame China for its own problems, right? So why? I mean, playing into that messaging is also, I think, strategically counterproductive, in addition to being the wrong thing to do for a lot of other reasons. So, it was kind of a long answer, but I think it's it's a hard question where we've got both real problems to address, and as well, I think, have to take a lot of care to make sure that we're not kind of descending into a lot of kind of racism and abuse of both people, U.S. citizens and permanent residents, as well as international students and the like. And I don't right now. I'm not terribly optimistic, unfortunately. All right, let's see. Sam, and then Rowan. I've got you the next two in the queue here. Sam?
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Yeah,
I
go ahead.
hit the lower hand rather than mute.
No problem. That's all right.
Anyway, No, so I just had a question around around COVID diplomacy and what we're seeing emerging there. So we've already seen sort of a few examples of shipments of medical supplies, protective equipment, things like this, either exported or donated. And it seems to me that going forward, this is something that, on the one hand, is something that China could continue to employ. On the other, using it excessively may open up to sort of a backlash from the use of medical supply exports to score geopolitical points. So I guess I'm just wondering, in your view, how would the calculus around when to use something like this and when not to work within sort of Chinese political circles making these decisions?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know, because it isn't very transparent, right? But there's, clearly, I think on the one hand, there's sort of an impulse to shift the narrative and change the story so that the story isn't, China, failed to be forthcoming and covered things up initially, and that cost time that other countries could have used to be better prepared. So I think they're trying to kind of move the messaging away from that and kind of get it more in the direction of China has tried to get this under control domestically, and at the same time has reached out to other countries to provide whatever kind of assistance it can, be it medical supplies or expertise or what have you. And they want to, clearly kind of create the impression that China is kind of acting in a very, constructive and helpful way globally, and with particular countries, I think want to kind of strengthen China's ties with those countries. In some instances, there are ones where China and the U.S., I think it's fair to say, are competing pretty hard for for influence. Now, on the other hand, obviously, you can kind of overplay your hand in doing that. There are a bunch of reported instances in which Chinese officials have insisted on sort of public thanks for the sales or donations of equipment. And some instances in which the Chinese aid was not sort of all that it was cracked up to be. Some where they seem to be kind of portraying commercial sales as a sort of a form of humanitarian assistance, which is not. I mean, if it's helpful, right? But it's also, there is a difference between a company selling something and a government donating something. So I mean, I think it has, some potential to partially backfire, but it also has a lot of potential to work. And I think it has potential to work, maybe even in instances where it's not, whether it's fully deserved or not, may not be directly correlated with how well it works in terms of influencing perceptions, right? Um, I think it's interesting, though, to see. I mean, of course, the U.S. is also doing some of this. Taiwan is doing it with the kind of theme is Taiwan can help, and I think President Tsai has been really effective in kind of promoting the Taiwan can help message, along with the what are some sales and some donations of of equipment. And I've been looking a little more closely at some of the transactions or donations from Taiwan, and I mean, very rough characterization. It tends to be sales to wealthier countries of equipment, and it's kind of humanitarian donations to less well-off countries that don't have the means available. So, for example, Taiwan has contributed a bunch of aid to its allies in the Pacific Islands, of which there are not that many left, but the ones who they still have official diplomatic relations with. Now, for Taiwan, that had a little bit of domestic blowback, because when I forget if it was a frigate or a destroyer, but whichever of their Navy ships they sent to one of the countries in the Pacific Islands came back with a bunch of people having a bunch of sailors having COVID-19 cases. So so there was some controversy surrounding that, but by and large, I think they've been in Taiwan really successful in kind of bolstering their relationships with countries that they're wanting to preserve or enhance them with, and to get out this sort of the Taiwan can help, Taiwan is helping is the the message. For China, more kind of a bit of a mixed bag. I think some results where they're likely to kind of accomplish what they were after. Others where there's more blowback. For the U.S., probably pretty similar. Some good results. I think with the with Palau, Micronesia, and the Marshall Islands, for example, at least tentatively, I think based on what I've seen so far, I think the State Department seems to have done pretty well, and is publicizing the activities that they've conducted there. In other areas we may not fare as successfully. And again, for the U.S. and for China, whether we kind of win the sort of battle of ideas is only partially a function of what we're actually doing, right? I mean, it's also kind of a function of how it's portrayed. And so you may have instances where there's more success than is really merited, or where kind of good deeds are fail to get the level of recognition that they deserve. I think both of those are likely outcomes in some instances. Let me go to Rowan next, and then I've got James Hunter after Rowan.
I just wanted to get your impressions of how China feels these influence operations are actually going in terms of improving their foreign policy objectives. My view in particularly in Australia is that it's been a real failure, and we've seen a real turn in public opinion on China in a country where it shouldn't necessarily be that way. The economic ties are still strong and have been, really strong for the last 20 years, really. And public opinion and the way China's talked about in Australia isn't matching that. We've also seen instances, for example, in Europe, in the Czech Republic and Sweden, where these initiatives go badly for China, and it really turns important countries that they should be trying to build and preserve relationships with, turning against them. And so, yeah, I'd be interested in your thoughts on whether you think China thinks that this is worth it, and whether it's working, or whether it will reconsider tactics going forward.
I think it's very likely that they'll reconsider at least some of the tactics going forward, because there's substantial blowback. I mean, as you described, if you just look at public opinion surveys in Australia, China is definitely losing ground in terms of how many people have a favorable view of China, or think it's important for Australia to have a sort of smooth relationship with with China. So. My guess is if they're, I'll say I haven't seen any direct evidence in terms of how top Chinese leaders think this is going, right? But my best guess is they probably think it was working pretty well for a while, and that and in certain respects may still be working well in terms of influencing kind of business leaders and others in different countries to kind of effectively function as constituencies for good relations with China. But clearly they're also experiencing a pretty big backlash, in particular in places where the the kind of diplomatic bullying has been really kind of public and a little bit extreme, and also in cases where the influence operations have been sort of blown and become public and received a lot more attention. It seems to really be kind of eroding kind of public views a lot. Now, there are other factors that are probably influencing public views of China as well. These aren't the only ones, and it's hard to kind of tease out from a lot of the survey research which ones are the most important and the like. But in terms of the the overall results, I mean, the trend line is mostly, I think, not good for China, truthfully. So if you look at things like the Pew Global, I think it's called Pew Global Indicators or Pew Global Attitude Survey, I think are that's where a lot of the good data comes from. Gallup and others do kind of similar global polling. And if you just look over the last 6 or 7 or 8 years, and see how attitudes toward China have shifted, China seems to be doing well in some places, but in a lot of places, it's deteriorating, right? The number of people who have a negative view of Chinese leaders and China is growing in a lot of countries, and they're kind of losing ground in, in that respect. Now, I mean, the U.S. has similar results in a lot of places too, and with the exception of, I was actually just looking at the Pew data for other reasons. I think with the exception of the Philippines and Israel, views of the U.S. have mostly been going in the wrong direction, from a U.S. point of view in recent years. Now, there is a little bit of a distinction here in that for the U.S., for many countries, there's a bigger gap between views of the U.S. as a country generally and views of U.S. leaders and Donald Trump specifically. So, for example, in the New Zealand data, you see generally pretty favorable views of the U.S., although they've kind of gone down a little in recent years. But where you see the really kind of precipitous decline is in the confidence that they have in when the question is something like, are your views of the U.S. favorable? Maybe it's going down a little, but it's still, I think, pretty good on the whole, doing better than China perhaps in that respect. But if you look at the question of, do you have confidence in the leader of country X to do the right thing in world affairs, or however they phrase it, there's a very, very sharp decline for the U.S. And similarly, not good numbers for Xi Jinping either. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag in a sense, but as it applies to really the kind of the issue at the heart of your question, I mean, I think some of what China is doing sure looks like it's counterproductive and is causing them to kind of lose some ground in terms of public opinion, and not just in Australia, but in other countries. And my only kind of reservation in answering the question that way is that I think there are other factors that are pushing in the same direction. So it's not just the, more information becoming public about influence operations and more kind of pointed diplomatic messages. I mean, I think it's also, particularly with more recent surveys, it has something to do with the pandemic, obviously. And then, if you look over the last, few years, it's probably also, I think, more general concerns about how China is using its power as it becomes a more capable and influential country. So some of that may have to do with kind of threats of economic coercion or concerns about Chinese military power, behavior in disputes with neighbors and the like. So I think it may be a confluence of factors that are pointing in the direction of kind of eroding public opinion regarding China in a bunch of places. But I think it's pretty certain that the United Front activities and influence operations are contributing to that downward trend. Thanks, Rowan. James?
Hi, thank you. While we're on the topic of Twitter and misinformation, I just wanted to solicit your thoughts while we have you for our last class on this ongoing rumors around Kim Jong-un and whether he's dead or not, and how China's sent a team of experts to North Korea, and what would you speculate is happening there? Why it's so difficult to dispel these rumors?
Well, yeah, that's so. I don't pretend to be a North Korea expert, and I'll say that the people who I really respect, who I think are the best North Korea experts, people like in Washington at least, like Jung Pak at Brookings and Bruce Klingner over at Heritage or AEI or wherever Bruce Klingner is now. I think that, in contrast to sort of the talking heads who who go on, whether it's Fox or CNN or wherever they go without a whole lot of evidence and just a bunch of hunches and things. I mean, look, I'll say that people like Jung Pak and Bruce Klingner who know North Korea, I think, as well as you can, as an outsider, are much more circumspect about what they think is going on, right? And so I'm going to go with them and say, you know what, we really don't know. We have certain facts. Kim Jong-un has not been seen in public for a while, right? He missed a couple of events where his attendance certainly was expected. One of which I understand to have been significantly more important and thus more kind of alerting that he wasn't there than the other. But we don't know, right? And so I saw there was a headline in one of the New York tabloids that I thought was kind of funny that a Korea watching friend forwarded to me that said, Kim Jong-un, dead, dying, or fine. And that was, and that's about right. So, we've heard from officials in South Korea that they think he's probably all right. China, of course, will be, even whether they know or not. I mean, I'm not sure, but if they do know, they're not going to say anything. And so we really have no idea what's happening. But what I would suggest is we can kind of talk about from China's point of view is, well, what do they do if in fact something is wrong here, right? Okay, so look, I mean, with the range of possibilities is he's sick, but he's generally okay, and he'll turn up again soon, or maybe he's doing like a very extreme form of pandemic, stay at home or something. All the way to he's already dead and they're just hiding it from the public, right? And so whatever on that spectrum, somewhere in between, has big implications for Chinese interests, huge implications. So, I would think that, China is probably devoting a lot of its own kind of intelligence and diplomatic resources to trying to get some ground truth in terms of what's really happening. I have no idea whether the reports that they've sent a team of doctors are accurate or not, but they very well may have, right? If they were invited to, or certainly I think they would want to accept that invitation if it was offered, because it would be a good way to find out what's happening, if nothing else. I would think that China's concerns in certain respects are kind of unique to China, right? They're worried about, security along the border. They're worried about refugees. They're worried about missile and nuclear facilities that are relatively close to the border with China. And then they've got, other concerns that might not be that different than U.S. concerns, kind of stability on the Korean Peninsula. Whether if in fact Kim Jong-un is seriously ill or dying or has died, what happens next in North Korea? How reliably under control should we assume their weapons of mass destruction are at this point, right? Or at some future point when something might, if something in fact is happening. But then they've got also kind of, so if there's one category of kind of unique to China concerns, another one of concerns that are largely shared by the US and Japan and South Korea, then there's also a category of divergent interests here. And that's that in a sort of post Kim Jong-un scenario, if one is in fact unfolding, China wants to protect its own interests on the Korean Peninsula and doesn't want there to be a situation in which the U.S. and its allies, kind of advance their interests at China's expense. They don't want a unified Korean Peninsula that is, closely allied with the United States and Japan, for example. They may not have much to worry about with respect to Japan, given how bad the Japan ROK relationship has been lately. But they'll certainly want to use all of the kind of intelligence and diplomatic resources that they have at their disposal in China to try to figure out what's going on, assuming I would guess that they may know better than anyone outside of North Korea, but they also might not. So, and I think they'll, if I imagine what Xi Jinping is demanding, it's to, first and foremost to know what's up better than, with a better level of fidelity than we're seeing reported in TMZ or speculated about on TV. And then next would be to try to ensure that if there is some kind of transition taking place, that China can try to exert enough influence to ensure that it works out in a way that's more or less consistent with Chinese interests. that much I think feel pretty sure about. What's actually happening in North Korea, a lot less so. And I'll urge everyone to follow the analysts who I think are cautious but appropriately so, like Jung Pak and Bruce Klingner and Laura Rosenberger and others who are not really speculating too much about what's actually going on, but I think provide a lot, and rightly so. I think they're right to be cautious in that respect, but can provide some really useful insights in terms of what would be the implications of different sort of plausible outcomes. So thank you, Benjamin. I've got you next on deck here.
Yeah, so this is also a question about China-North Korea relations, but is it also your experience that even in track 2 dialogues, the Chinese scholars or policymakers would never engage with Americans about a contingency plan? What if North Korea collapses? What if there's a preemptive strike? Has that been your experience as well?
They can be a little bit more forthcoming in the right setting. It's still, I mean, it's a very sensitive topic. They obviously don't want to talk about things that, if it gets back to North Korea, would be damaging to China's rather delicate relationship with North Korea. At the same time, I think they recognize there are, scenarios in which there would be both kind of competing and overlapping interests between the US and China, and it's not totally impossible to get people to kind of discuss some of those in a sort of hypothetical sense, in the abstract at a normal time, not one like necessarily we're experiencing right now, where I would think it would be very, very difficult for them to talk about this in a lot of detail. But there are, and again, there's, I think what I would consider within the realm of things that you could expect people to talk about is not going to extend down to like a level of, would Chinese special forces, seize the nuclear weapons at, this particular location, or would, the US do something at some other location? I mean, obviously they're not, wouldn't be, I think, able to talk about something like that, but are also not, completely unwilling to have any kind of discussions about, how various kind of crisis scenarios, might unfold. Yeah, and I think you can find a few kind of think tank reports online that are kind of, illustrative of some of those types of discussions, which are, again, are only barely possible and at a pretty general level, I would say, but are sort of possible. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, I think that's about the answer I expected.
Yeah. And of course, right now would be an excellent time to have a better understanding of each other's perspectives on this, but also is probably the most difficult time because of the sensitivity of the China's relationship with North Korea. And again, I don't know whether China, Chinese leaders might, perhaps reasonably be expected to know more than we do in the U.S. I'm sure they'd like to know more than we do in the U.S. Whether they actually do or not is another question. Any other questions or comments? The one I kind of wanted to get into a little bit for the time we have remaining is, basically, do you think that the kind of more assertive Chinese diplomacy, which I'll define very broadly to also include the kind of information domain stuff, do you think that that's here to stay, or might it be adjusted? And one way or the other, what are the implications, for China and for the U.S.? David, you want to take a stab at this?
Yeah, it's definitely a stab. So I for a number of different reasons, have been reading quite a bit of Nadej Roland and a few others. I know you sent me the Daniel Tobin thing, and the concept of the discourse war seems to be policy perspective or a policy position taken by Xi Jinping. And so I would say if I had to bet, as long as the Xi administration is in place, that is going to continue to be a thing. And it may be modified, but I think that they definitely have a commitment to that discourse war concept. I found both of them very convincing in making those arguments, Roland and Tobin. So yeah, I'd expect more of the same with lessons learned along the way.
Yeah, I think that's a good. I mean, I think tactical adjustments, if we see them, probably we shouldn't mistake those for a major change in strategic direction, right? They would be more of a an adjustment based on seeing whether particular tactics seem to be backfiring, right? But that would not. I agree that wouldn't reflect a decision to kind of abandon the information domain struggle, but rather sort of more of a taking stock of some lessons learned and maybe adjusting some of their tactics to try to be more effective in pursuing those goals in the information domain, right? Because I do think that there's like you said, just there's a strong commitment here at the top to trying to kind of influence that environment in a way that's more favorable to China, and that means at a minimum, kind of having more favorable portrayals and more as Chinese leaders have talked about, kind of China doing a better job of telling its story, externally and so on, right? I mean, that for sure is here to stay. Some of the kind of sharper elbows kind of tactics, if they backfire, might be adjusted or even abandoned. But I think the as you said, the overall approach that Nadezhda Roland and Dan Tobin and others have chronicled, I think is not about to change anytime soon. Because again, while in the U.S., when we talk about diplomatic, information, military, and economic elements of power, we spend a lot of time on the military one, maybe economic next, diplomatic after that, and information kind of comes last. And generally speaking, I think China sees it somewhat differently in that these are all really important instruments in trying to deal with the kind of foreign and security policy challenges that they've identified. And I think, maybe, in a sense, because I think, a lot of Chinese military strategists who write about kind of global security challenges would acknowledge that their challenges became global a lot more rapidly than their military capabilities. That might also kind of increase the premium that they attach to using other instruments of power to pursue their interests in in places where they right now have little or no ability to kind of project and sustain military power. Now, even when they do, it still might not be the preferred way of dealing with a particular problem, right? And hence the information one is relatively cheap. Might have a lot of return on investment. May turn out to be not quite as low risk in terms of blowback as they expected, but still a relatively cheap and sometimes effective means of advancing their interests. So yeah, so I would agree completely that I don't see any change in the goals here. I don't probably see any near-term change in the strategy, but we certainly might see some adjustment in tactics. Other questions or comments or thoughts on this question of whether some of what China is doing here is likely to, result in a situation where the costs might outweigh the benefits? Should we? I don't think we should expect Xi Jinping to get his own Twitter account anytime soon. But that would, of course, now that I say that, it'll probably happen, right? But that would be, certainly a new stage in a confident, assertive Chinese diplomacy. Any other thoughts or questions?
I have a thought. I mean,
yeah, go ahead.
We've discussed this in the context of climate change and globalization and Chinese leadership sort of asserting itself, China asserting itself sort of as the U.S. retreats in certain areas. You would think that this sort of rhetoric would backfire and undermine that type of effort to appeal to the wider, particularly to Europe and and U.S. allies as the U.S. sort of abandons its allies in some fronts, like climate change and other areas.
Yeah, so I think very unfortunately, the U.S. has created a big, sort of void that China can kind of launch itself into in certain areas, climate change and sort of the, international trade being prominent ones. Now, I mean, and again, whether China's actions merit the gains it might make in these areas is one question. Whether they're going to make the gains or not anyway, is another question, right? So, I think if their kind of information operations and diplomacy are sufficiently adept, China may kind of make some gains at the expense of the U.S., even in areas where their own actions, sort of belie their rhetoric, right? But there are also, I think, some potential opportunities for them to do not just kind of, information operation things, but to do real stuff that will, kind of help them advance their interests here. And I'll say, one example would be if the U.S. and really not just the U.S., but unfortunately, the U.S. and to a certain extent also Australia are not able to kind of step up on the climate change and sea level rise issues for countries in Oceania, for example, right in the Pacific Islands, and China is able to actually really contribute something that will certainly end up being a failure on the part of the U.S. and its allies that China takes advantage of, right? So there are some areas where we're unfortunately creating real opportunities for them to do that. There are other areas where it may be that our own actions are kind of backfiring, that China's really are not much better, but that they're doing a better job kind of shaping the narrative around that such that it kind of, rebounds to their advantage. So there I think, are some that probably fall into that category as well. Let's see, Rowan?
Yeah, firstly, to say, I mean, you comment just there on climate change in the South Pacific. I think it's spot on, and there's been some, even some really recent developments on that, particularly in Australia's relationship with Fiji. But I just wanted to mention and get your thoughts on, the conversation of the effectiveness of influence and lobbying. One interaction I had with a couple of Chinese officials really sort of demonstrated the difficulty China faces on this issue, because their view was that Israel does this all the time in terms of lobbying for a particular foreign policy objective in Australia, and you could argue the same here in the US. And what's the difference between what we're trying to do and what Israel's been capable of doing for many years? And so I thought that was kind of an interesting sign that they're kind of exploring this as they go, and they don't really know what's effective, what's not, and what's going to have an impact. So just wanted to offer that observation.
Yeah, thank you. It's an interesting observation. I've heard kind of similar stuff from some Chinese counterparts also, sort of along the line. They didn't mention Israel specifically, but sort of the general idea being, well, lots of other countries try to influence the U.S. Or Japan or Australia or the UK or whoever, and so why is it that China is taking a lot of flack for this? And I mean, I think the short answer is, well, there are a range of activities that I think are pretty standard diplomatic activities, right? And then there's a range of things that I think most people would consider to be sort of like a covert action or an intelligence operation, right? And some of those are very distinct from each other, but there's also a lot of stuff sort of in between that maybe is a little bit less clear cut. And I think it's fair to say that a lot of where they've gotten in trouble has been sort of in that gray area in between. So I mean, like, and what I'm saying there is, I mean, pushier diplomacy that people resent is not illegitimate. It might backfire. I mean, it's an approach to diplomacy that may or may not work out, and I think probably won't. But that's kind of over on one end of the spectrum here. On the other end, you've got stuff like, I'll say, like the Russians did in not just in 2016, but in the U.S., but have done elsewhere and continue to do in different places. And that's creating fake personas that set up competing demonstrations against each other to try to exacerbate societal divisions, right? I mean, that's not diplomatic activity. That's an activity that, in their case, I think it was, I forget which one, but one of their intelligence services was carrying out to basically try to sort of foment, unrest and kind of, I guess from their point of view, kind of weaken the U.S. politically. Channeling money to a particular political campaign in violation of a country's laws to try to influence the outcome of it, or to influence politicians to favorable policies toward your country, would obviously be on the on the end of the spectrum, where you're breaking the law in that particular country, right? That's not consequences, right? But some of the things in between that are more sort of lobbying are a little bit a little bit harder to kind of judge. And I think that that they may get themselves in some in some trouble in those areas too. But that's the area where I think the argument that I've heard Chinese counterparts make as well. I haven't heard them reference Israel specifically, although that's an interesting example. But I've heard them refer to Taiwan and say, well, Taiwan sponsors events at think tanks and universities, and if TECRO or the local TECO office does that, do people say that this is some sort of undue influence that that they're undermining the academic independence of this institution or whatever? And I think the answer there is, well, if they're sponsoring an event but not attaching any strings to it, or demanding a particular outcome, or excluding people from it, and or what have you, that's of course they're not going to kind of take the heat that that you'll take if you insist that people with different political views are barred from the event, that it must produce an outcome that adheres to guidelines that you're providing or something. Now you're getting right in an area where the reaction is likely to be different. So I think I do think though that there's kind of an element of just trying to kind of deflect blame by saying, well, other countries do this stuff too. The only difference is that we got caught, right? But there may also be some areas in which I think they're probably not really sure, why they think that they're getting a reaction that's different than what they perceive others who are doing things that they think are kind of similar are getting. Let's see. And I'll say, I mean, I think there's a legitimate difference here, right? And I think part of the reason they're getting in trouble, even if they don't really see the difference on the Chinese side, is, if a Chinese entity sponsors an event and then says, but you can't have this individual speak there, or you can't cover this topic, or can't say this or that. They're likely to, and rightly so, to kind of face accusations of trying to exert some sort of undue influence. Whereas if you have a more open-ended approach to it, and people are suspicious of your sponsorship, as long as you can demonstrate that you haven't tried to exert some kind of inappropriate influence, you at least can kind of claim the high ground and saying, I didn't do what you're accusing me of doing. Of course, I mean, the reality is a lot of times they are doing, they are doing what, what people are accusing them of doing. So, yeah, I mean, again, I would expect to see probably some tactical adjustments, but not. I think that they, on the Chinese side, long before Xi Jinping, but it's been amplified really in the Xi era, have concluded that the sort of informational or kind of narrative domain that they're going after here is an important one for them to kind of contend and compete in. Let's see, David, is your hand still up from before, or do you have another comment?
Sorry, my Zoom was messing up on me. No, my hand was up from before. I'll lower it.
Okay, no problem. All right, well, let me just leave a minute here if anybody wants to ask any other questions or offer any more comments before we wrap up. I'll allow a little time for people to figure out how to raise their hand and unmute themselves and all of that. If I don't see, oh, okay, Benjamin, go ahead.
Since this is our last class, I just wanted to ask, is there anything that makes you feel optimistic about the future of U.S.-China relations?
That's a good question. That's a good question to wrap up on. Sort of. Okay, let me put it this way. I think that sort of, but let me put that within a broader framework. So I think the relationship has been moving in the direction of more competition for influence and strategic competition for a long time. I don't really think that that's something that is completely new on the U.S. side for the Trump administration. I think they kind of, in fact, I remember Matt Pottinger, who was the senior Asia official at the National Security Council earlier in the administration and since was promoted. He gave a talk at a think tank in Washington where he sort of said, kind of contrary to their overall messaging about, in quotation marks, now we're competing with China, right? I mean, he basically said, we've been competing with China, now we're just openly saying so. And I think that that's a basically accurate characterization. So this, predated, there may be aspects of it that are unique to the current administration, but the sort of general trend has been moving in this direction for a while. Likewise, on the Chinese side, it's not as though everything was cooperative and then all of a sudden Xi Jinping appeared and decided to, be tough with, with the U.S., right? I mean, I think it's the direction that China has been moving in for a long time as a result of their own kind of strategic perceptions and the kind of change in the balance of power and the like, that you can again trace pretty clearly to at least sort of maybe the second half of the Hu Jintao's time in office, if not earlier. So this is I think things have been heading in this more kind of sharply competitive direction for a while. But that said, I don't think it doesn't have to preclude cooperation in areas of shared interests. And I think that, again, if you even, if you look back to the sort of, I generally speaking don't think the Cold War is the exact right, frame to use for looking ahead for the U.S.-China relationship. But even if you look back to the periods of the Cold War when the U.S. and the Soviet Union were sharply at odds over most important international issues, and had just an almost completely adversarial relationship, there were still areas in which it was just pragmatic to be more cooperative. And I think that I don't think that there's any reason to expect that the U.S. and China will in the right this minute. There's a lot of retweeting conspiracy theories back and forth, which is not helping anybody. But I mean, I think that in the longer run of say the next several years, not just the next few weeks or months, I would think that in those areas where both sides are better off cooperating than sort of defecting, they should be able to manage that, notwithstanding a relationship that overall is likely to be a lot more acrimonious. But they're not going to do it as a favor to the other side. They're going to do it because it better serves their interests to cooperate in that particular area than the alternative. So, I mean, I don't know. I wouldn't necessarily say that that's optimistic, I guess, but I think it's at least suggests that there is still, there are some prospects for cooperation again in those areas where both sides judge that they're better off doing so. And there are a couple of people who are starting to write about this a little bit. What does kind of cooperation look like, within the broader frame of a more, not necessarily adversarial, but much more competitive relationship. Jacob Stokes from USIP has a couple short pieces on this, and others are kind of joining the kind of academic and policy fray on this question. But areas that I would kind of think of. I mean, international health really ought to be one, and may not be right this minute, but I think will reemerge as one. Climate and environmental issues. Again, there will be instances where there's a lot of sort of adversarial diplomacy going on about who will bear the burden to do what and so on. But it's an area where at least sometimes I think both sides will be better off cooperating than sort of defecting. But again, they'll have to, I think, recognize that and actually do it. But there is a track record of cooperation in some of those areas, and again, there's a track record of countries that are have strategic rivalries that are pretty deep, still managing to work together when they both conclude that working together, difficult as it might be at times, at least sometimes is a superior option, compared to failing to do so. And admittedly, that's not like a super optimistic note to wrap up on. So, so let me kind of wrap up by saying something a little bit different, which is, obviously, when we all began the semester, I don't think anyone anticipated that this is how it would end, or that basically almost the entire second half of it, would all be done remotely with people scattered, pretty much around the U.S. and around the world. I've certainly enjoyed the class a lot, notwithstanding the difficulties that we're all facing right now, and the reality that turning a class into a virtual or online class halfway through, is a sort of a challenging undertaking that I think, I'll say, honestly, I think has worked well in some respects, and and leaves room for improvement in others. But one area in which I don't think there's any room for improvement is that you all have been terrific students and have contributed a lot to the class. I've enjoyed it a lot. I hope that that you've learned a lot from each other as part of this class. And I appreciate the kind of dedication and devotion to trying to make this work under very trying circumstances. I think that certainly speaks very well of all of you in terms of your motivation and dedication, and it's made it the transition certainly to doing this the way that we are, I think at least relatively successful, for which I think you all deserve as much credit as anyone, for sure. And I don't know, well, I know for anyone who's taking a summer class, it's at least going to start out like this. Don't know what it'll be like by the end of the summer for those who are returning in the fall. Of course, we don't know exactly what we're going to be confronting in the fall, but we're going to all try and do it together and make the best of it. And I really appreciate all of your contributions and efforts to kind of keep this going under, again, I think circumstances that were certainly not ones that any of us expected at the beginning of the academic year or the semester. So thanks to everyone for all that you've done and all the effort that you've put into the class. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. And please feel free to keep in touch. I'm happy to help out, like I said at the beginning, if you need recommendations, want to talk about jobs, or have questions about your second year at SAIS for those who are entering it in the fall. I'm happy to talk about all those kinds of things. So for now, I look forward to reading your papers and viewing the remaining presentations. Stay safe and healthy. Take care. And for those who I may not see until the fall, have a good summer break. And for those who are graduating, best of luck. It's a challenging environment to graduate into, for sure. But congratulations nevertheless, and let me know if there's anything I can do to help out. So I'm going to wrap up there, and please do keep in touch. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Professor.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.